Section 20 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 20. Latona and the Rustics. Through the tropic nights, their sonorous, bell-like booming can be heard coming up from the marshes, and when they are unseen, the song of the bullfrogs would suggest creatures full of solemn dignity. The croak of their lesser brethren is less impressive, yet there is no escape from it on those evenings when the dragonfly's iridescent wings are folded in sleep, and the birds in the branches are still, when the lilies on the pond have closed their golden hearts, and even the late-feeding trout have ceased to plop and to make eddies in the quiet water. Croak, croak, croak they go. Croak, croak, croak. It is unceasing, unending. It goes on like the whir of the wheels of a great clock that can never run down, a melancholy complaint against the hardships of destiny, a raucous protest against things as they are. This is the story of the frogs that have helped to point the jibes of Aristophanes, the morals of Aesop, and which have always been, more or less, regarded as the low comedians of the animal world. Latona, or Leto, was the goddess of dark nights, and upon her the mighty Zeus bestowed the doubtful favour of his errant love. Great was the wrath of Hera, his queen, when she found that she was no longer the dearest wife of her omnipotent lord, and with furious upbraidings she banished her rival to earth. And when Latona had reached the place of her exile, she found that the vengeful goddess had sworn that she would place her everlasting ban upon anyone, mortal or immortal, who dared to show any kindness or pity to her whose only fault had been that Zeus loved her. From place to place she wandered, an outcast even among men, until at length she came to Lycia. One evening, as the darkness of which she was goddess had just begun to fall, she reached a green and pleasant valley. The soft, cool grass was a delight to her tired feet, and when she saw the silvery gleam of water she rejoiced, for her throat was parched and her lips dry, and she was very weary. By the side of this still pond, where the lilies floated, there grew lithe grey willows and fresh green osiers, and these were being cut by a crowd of chattering rustics. Humbly, for many a rude word and harsh rebuff had the dictum of Hera brought her during her wanderings, Latona went to the edge of the pond, and kneeling down was most thankfully about to drink when the peasants espied her. Roughly and rudely they told her to be gone, nor dare to drink unbidden of the clear water beside which their willows grew. Very pitifully Latona looked up in their churlish faces, and her eyes were as the eyes of a doe that the hunters have pressed very hard. "Surely, good people," she said, and her voice was sad and low, "water is free to all. Very far have I travelled, and I am aweary almost to death. Only grant that I dip my lips in the water for one deep draught. Of thy pity, grant me this boon, for I perish of thirst." Harsh and coarse were the mocking voices that made answer. Coarser still were the jests that they made. Then one, bolder than his fellows, spurned her kneeling figure with his foot, while another brushed before her, and, stepping into the pond, defiled its clarity by churning up the mud that lay below with his great splay feet. Loudly the peasants laughed at this merry jest, and they quickly followed his lead, as brainless sheep will follow the one that scrambles through a gap. Soon they were all joyously stamping and dancing in what had so lately been a pellucid pool. The water lilies and blue forget-me-nots were trodden down. The fish that had their homes under the mossy stones in terror fled away. Only the mud came up, filthy, defiling, and the rustics laughed in loud and foolish laughter to see the havoc they had wrought. The goddess Latona rose from her knees. No longer did she seem a mere woman, very weary, hungry and athirst, travelled over far. In their surprised eyes she grew to a stature that was as that of the deathless gods, and her eyes were dark as an angry sea at even. "Shameless ones!" she said, in a voice as the voice of a storm that sweeps destroyingly over forest and mountain. "Ah, shameless ones! Is it thus that thou wouldst defy one who has dwelt on Olympus? Behold, from henceforth shalt thou have thy dwelling in the mud of the green scummed pools, thy homes in the water that thy flat feet have defiled." As she spoke, a change, strange and terrible, passed over the forms of the trampling peasants. Their stature shrank, they grew squat and fat. Their hands and feet were webbed, and their grinning mouths became great, sad, gaping openings by which to swallow worms and flies. Green and yellow and brown were their skins, and when they would fain have cried aloud for mercy, from their throats there would come only the croak, croak, croak that we know so well. And when that night the goddess of darkness was wrapped in peace in the black silver star bespangled robe that none could take from her, there arose from the pond over which the grey willows hung, weeping, the clamour of a great lamentation. Yet no piteous words were there, only the incessant harsh complaint of the frogs that we hear in the marshes. From that time the world went well with Latona. Down to the seashore she came, and when she held out her arms in longing appeal to the Aegean islands that lay like purple flowers strewn far apart on a soft carpet of limpid blue, Zeus heard her prayer. He asked Poseidon to send a dolphin to carry the woman he loved to the floating island of Delos, and when she had been borne there in safety, he chained the island with chains of adamant to the golden sanded floor of the sea. And on this sanctuary there were born to Latona twin children, thereafter to be amongst the most famed of the deathless gods, the god and goddess Apollo and Diana. Those hinds that were transformed to frogs railed at Latona's twin-born progeny, which after held the sun and moon in fee. Milton. Yet there are times, as we look at the squat, bronze bodies of the frogs, green bronze, dark brown spotted, and all flecked with gold, the turned-down corners of their wistful mouths, their very exquisite black velvety eyes with golden rims, when the piteous croaks that come forth from their throats of pale daffodil colour do indeed awake a sympathy with their appeal against the inexorable decrees of destiny. We did not know, we did not understand. Pity us, ah, pity us! Croak, croak, croak. End of Latona and the Rustics. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 21 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 21. Echo and Narcissus. In the solitudes of the hills we find her, and yet we may come on her unawares in the din of a noisy city. She will answer us where the waves are lashing themselves against the rugged cliffs of our own British coast, or we may find her where the great yellow pillars of fallen temples lie, hot in the sun, close to the vivid blue water of the African Sea. At nightfall, on the lonely northern moors, she mimics the cry of a wailing bird that calls for its mate, but it is she who prolongs the roll of the great organ in a vast cathedral, she who repeats the rattle and crack and boom of the guns, no matter in what land the war may be raging. In the desolate Australian bush she makes the crash of the falling limb of a dead gum tree go on, and tortures the human being who is lost, hopelessly lost, and facing a cruel death, by repeating his despairing calls for help. Through the night, in old country houses, she sports at will and gives new life to sad old tales of the restless dead who restlessly walk. But she echoes the children's voices as they play by the seashore or pick primroses in the woods in spring, and when they greet her with laughter, she laughs in merry response. They may fear her when the sun has gone down, and when they are left all alone they begin to dread her mockery. Yet the nymph who sought for love and failed to gain what she sought must surely find some comfort on those bright days of summer and of spring, when she gives the little children happiness and they give her their love. When all the world was young, and nymphs and fauns and dryads dwelt in the forests, there was no nymph more lovely and more gay than she whose name was Echo. Diana would smile on her for her fleetness of foot when she followed her in the chase, and those whom she met in the leafy pathways of the dim green woods would pass on smiling at the remembrance of her merry chatter and her tricksy humour. It was an evil day for Echo when she crossed the path of Hera, queen of the gods. The jealous goddess sought her errant husband, who was amusing himself with some nymphs, and Echo, full of mischievous glee, kept her in talk until the nymphs had fled to safety. Hera was furious indeed when she found out that a frolicsome nymph had dared to play on her such a trick, and ruthlessly she spoke fair of Echo's doom. "Henceforth," she said, "the tongue with which thou hast cheated me shall be in bonds. No longer wilt thou have the power to speak in greeting. To the tongues of others shall thy tongue be slave, and from this day until time shall cease, thou shalt speak only to repeat the last words that have fallen on thine ears." A maimed nymph indeed was Echo then, yet whole in all that matters most, in that her merry heart was still her own. But only for a little while did this endure. Narcissus, the beautiful son of a nymph and a river god, was hunting in a lonely forest one day when Echo saw him pass. To her he seemed more fair than god or man, and once she had seen him she knew that she must gain his love or die. From that day on she haunted him like his shadow, gliding from tree to tree, nestling down amongst thick fern and undergrowth, motionless as one who stalks a wild thing, watching him afar off while he rested, gladdening her eyes with his beauty. So did she feed her hungering heart, and sought to find contentment by looking on his face each day. To her at length came a perfect moment when Narcissus was separated from his companions in the chase, and, stopping suddenly where the evening sun chequered the pathway of the forest with black and gold, heard the nymph's soft footfall on the rustling leaves. "Who's here?" he called. "Here," answered Echo. Narcissus, peering amongst the trees' long shadows and seeing no one, called, "Come!" and "Come!" called the glad voice of Echo, while the nymph, with fast beating heart, felt that her day of happiness had come indeed. "Why do you shun me?" then called Narcissus. "Why do you shun me?" Echo repeated. "Let us join one another," said the lad, and the simple words seemed turned into song when Echo said them over. "Let us join one another," she said. And not Eos herself, as with rosy fingers she turns aside the dark clouds of night, could be fairer than was the nymph as she pushed aside the leaves of the trackless wood and ran forward with white arms outstretched to him who was lord of her life. With cold eyes and colder heart the one she loved beheld her. "Away!" he cried, shrinking back as if from something that he hated. "Away! I would rather die than that you should have me." "Have me?" cried Echo pitifully, but she pled in vain. Narcissus had no love to give her, and his scorn filled her with shame. Thenceforth, in the forest revels she never more was seen, and the nymphs danced gaily as ever, with never a care for her who had faded and gone away as completely as though she were a blossom in the passing of spring. In the solitude of mountain cliffs and caves and rocky places, and in the loneliest depths of the forest, Echo hid her grief. And when the winds blew through the dark branches of the trees at night, moaning and sighing, they could hear far below them the voice of Echo repeating their lamentations. For her, long nights followed hopeless days, and nights and days only told her that her love was all in vain. Then came a night when the winds no longer saw the figure of the nymph. White and frail as a broken flower, crouching close to the rocks, they passed over. Grief had slain the body of Echo. Only her voice was left to repeat their mocking laughter, their wistful sighs. Only her voice, that lives on still though all the old gods are gone, and but few there are who know her story. Heart whole and happy, Narcissus, slayer of happiness, went on his way, and other nymphs besides fair Echo suffered from loving him in vain. One nymph, less gentle than Echo, poured the tale of her love that was scorned into the sympathetic ears of the goddess of love, and implored her to punish Narcissus. Hot and tired from the chase, Narcissus sought one day a lonely pool in the woods, there to rest and to quench his thirst. In some delicious ramble he had found a little space, with boughs all woven round, and in the midst of all, a clearer pool than e'er reflected in its pleasant cool the blue sky here and there serenely peeping through tendril wreaths fantastically creeping. As he stooped down to drink, a face looked at his through the crystal clear water, and a pair of beautiful eyes met his own. His surprise and joy at the sight of what he felt sure must be the most beautiful creature on earth was evidently shared by the nymph of the pool, who gazed fearlessly up at him. Round her head she had a nimbus of curls than which that of Adonis, nay, of the sun god himself, was not more perfect, while her eyes were like the brown pools of water in a rippling mountain stream, flecked with sunshine, yet with depths untold. When Narcissus smiled at her in rapture, her red lips also parted in a smile. He stretched out his arms towards her, and her arms were stretched to him. Almost trembling in his delight, he slowly stooped to kiss her. Nearer she drew to him, nearer still, but when his mouth would have given itself to that other mouth that was formed like the bow of Eros, a thing to slay hearts, only the chilly water of the pool touched his lips, and the thing of his delight vanished away. In passionate disappointment Narcissus waited for her to return, and as soon as the water of the pool grew still, once more he saw her exquisite face gazing wistfully up into his. Passionately he pled with the beautiful creature, spoke of his love, besought her to have pity on him. But although the face in the pool reflected his every look of adoration and of longing, time and again he vainly tried to clasp in his arms what was but the mirrored likeness of himself. In full measure had the avenging goddess meted out to Narcissus the restless longing of unsatisfied love. By day and by night he haunted the forest pool, and ere long the face that looked back at his was pale as a lily in the dawn. When the moonbeams came straying down through the branches and all the night was still, they found him kneeling by the pool, and the white face that the water mirrored had the eyes of one of the things of the woods to which a huntsman has given a mortal wound. Mortally wounded he truly was, slain, like many another since his day, by a hopeless love for what was in truth but an image, and that an image of his own creation. Even when his shade passed across the dark Stygian river, it stooped over the side of the boat that it might try to catch a glimpse of the beloved one in the inky waters. Echo and the other nymphs were avenged, yet when they looked on the beautiful dead Narcissus, they were filled with sorrow. And when they filled the air with their lamentations, most piteously did the voice of Echo repeat each mournful cry. Even the gods were pitiful, and when the nymphs would have burned the body on a funeral pyre which their own fair hands had built for him, they sought it in vain, for the Olympians had turned Narcissus into a white flower, the flower that still bears his name and keeps his memory sweet. A lonely flower he spied, a meek and forlorn flower, with naught of pride, drooping its beauty o'er the watery clearness, to woo its own sad image into nearness. Deaf to light Zephyrus it would not move, but still would seem to droop, to pine, to love. Keats. End of Echo and Narcissus. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 22 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jane Lang. Section 22. Icarus. 14 years only have passed since our 20th century began. In those 14 years, how many a father's and mother's heart has bled for the death of gallant sons, greatly promising, greatly daring, who have sought to rule the skies. With wings not well enough tried, they have soared dauntlessly aloft, only to add more names to the tragic list of those whose lives have been sacrificed in order that the groping hands of science may become sure, so that in time the sons of men may sail through the heavens as fearlessly as their fathers sailed through the seas. High overhead we watch the monoplane, the great swooping thing, like a monster black-winged bird, and our minds travel back to the story of Icarus, who died so many years ago that there are those who say that his story is but a foolish fable, an idle myth. Daedalus, grandson of a king of Athens, was the greatest artificer of his day. Not only as an architect was he great, but as a sculptor he had the creative power not only to make men and women and animals that looked alive, but to cause them to move and to be, to all appearances, endowed with life. To him the artificers who followed him owed the invention of the axe, the wedge, the wimble, and the carpenter's level, and his restless mind was ever busy with new inventions. To his nephew Talus, or Perdrix, he taught all that he himself knew of all the mechanical arts. Soon it seemed that the nephew, though he might not excel his uncle, equalled Daedalus in his inventive power. As he walked by the seashore, the lad picked up the spine of a fish, and, having pondered its possibilities, he took it home, imitated it in iron, and so invented the saw. A still greater invention followed this. While those who had always thought that there could be none greater than Daedalus were still acclaiming the lad, there came to him the idea of putting two pieces of iron together, connecting them at one end with a rivet, and sharpening both ends, and a pair of compasses was made. Louder still were the acclamations of the people. Surely greater than Daedalus was here. Too much was this for the artist's jealous spirit. One day they stood together on the top of the Acropolis, and Daedalus, murder that comes from jealousy in his heart, threw his nephew down. Down, down he fell, knowing well that he was going to meet a cruel death. But Pallas Athena, protectress of all clever craftsmen, came to his rescue. By her, Perdrix was turned into the bird that still bears his name, and Daedalus beheld Perdrix, the partridge, rapidly winging his way to the far-off fields. Since then, no partridge has ever built or roosted in a high place, but has nestled in the hedge roots and amongst the standing corn, and as we mark it we can see that its flight is always low. For his crime, Daedalus was banished from Athens, and in the court of Minos, king of Crete, he found a refuge. He put all his mighty powers at the service of Minos, and for him designed an intricate labyrinth which, like the river Meander, had neither beginning nor ending, but ever returned on itself in hopeless intricacy. Soon he stood high in the favour of the king, but ever greedy for power, he incurred by one of his daring inventions the wrath of Minos. The angry monarch threw him into prison, and imprisoned along with him his son, Icarus. But prison bars and locks did not exist that were strong enough to baffle this master craftsman, and from the tower in which they were shut, Daedalus and his son were not long in making their escape. To escape from Crete was a less easy matter. There were many places in that wild island where it was easy for the father and son to hide, but the subjects of Minos were mostly mariners, and Daedalus knew well that all along the shore they kept watch lest he should make him a boat, hoist on it one of the sails of which he was part inventor, and speed away to safety like a sea-bird driven before the gale. Then did there come to Daedalus, the pioneer of inventions, the great idea that by his skill he might make a way for himself and his son through another element than water. And he laughed aloud in his hiding place amongst the cypresses on the hillside at the thought of how he would baffle the simple sailormen who watched each creek and beach down on the shore. Mockingly, too, did he think of King Minos, who had dared to pit his power against the wits and skill of Daedalus, the mighty craftsman. Many a Cretan bird was sacrificed before the task which the inventor had set himself was accomplished. In a shady forest on the mountains he fashioned light wooden frames and decked them with feathers until at length they looked like the pinions of a great eagle or of a swan that flaps its majestic way from lake to river. Each feather was bound on with wax, and the mechanism of the wings was so perfect a reproduction of that of the wings from which the feathers had been plucked that on the first day that he fastened them to his back and spread them out, Daedalus found that he could fly even as the bird flew. 2 pairs he made. Having tested one pair, a second pair was made for Icarus, and circling round him like a mother bird that teaches her nestlings how to fly, Daedalus, his heart big with the pride of invention, showed Icarus how he might best soar upwards to the sun or dive down to the blue sea far below, and how he might conquer the winds and the air currents of the sky and make them his servants. That was a joyous day for father and son, for the father had never before drunk deeper of the intoxicating wine of the gods, success, and for the lad it was all pure joy. Never before had he known freedom and power so utterly glorious. As a little child he had watched the birds fly far away over the blue hills to where the sun was setting, and had longed for wings that he might follow them in their flight. At times in his dreams he had known the power, and in his dreaming fancy had risen from the cumbering earth and soared high above the trees and fields on strong pinions that bore him away to the fair land of heart's desire, to the islands of the blessed. But when sleep left him, and the dreams silently slipped out before the coming of the light of day, and the boy sprang from his couch and eagerly spread his arms as, in his dreams, he had done, he could no longer fly. Disappointment and unsatisfied longing ever came with his waking hours. Now all that had come to an end, and Daedalus was glad and proud as well to watch his son's joy and his fearless daring. One word of counsel only did he give him. "Beware, dear son of my heart," he said, "lest in thy new-found power thou seekest to soar even to the gates of Olympus. For as surely as the scorching rays from the burnished wheels of the chariot of Apollo smite thy wings, the wax that binds on thy feathers will melt, and then will come upon thee and on me woe unutterable." In his dreams that night Icarus flew, and when he awoke, fearing to find only the haunting remembrance of a dream, he found his father standing by the side of his bed of soft leaves under the shadowy cypresses, ready to bind on his willing shoulders the great pinions that he had made. Gentle Dawn the rosy-fingered was slowly making her way up from the east when Daedalus and Icarus began their flight. Slowly they went at first, and the goatherds who tended their flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida looked up in fear when they saw the dark shadows of their wings and marked the monster birds making their way out to sea. From the river beds the waterfowl arose from the reeds, and with great outcry flew with all their swiftness to escape them. And down by the seashore the mariners' hearts sank within them as they watched, believing that a sight so strange must be a portent of disaster. Homewards they went in haste to offer sacrifices on the altars of Poseidon, ruler of the deep. Samos and Delos were passed on the left and Lebynthos on the right, long ere the sun god had started on his daily course. And as the mighty wings of Icarus cleft the cold air, the boy's slim body grew chilled, and he longed for the sun's rays to turn the waters of the Aegean Sea, over which he flew, from green grey into limpid sapphire and emerald and burning gold. Towards Sicily he and his father bent their course, and when they saw the beautiful island afar off lying like a gem in the sea, Apollo made the waves in which it lay for it a fitting setting. With a cry of joy Icarus marked the sun's rays paint the chill water, and Apollo looked down at the great white-winged bird, a snowy swan with the face and form of a beautiful boy, who sped exulting onwards, while a clumsier thing, with wings of darker hue, followed less quickly in the same line of flight. As the god looked, the warmth that radiated from his chariot touched the icy limbs of Icarus as with the caressing touch of gentle, life-giving hands. Not long before, his flight had lagged a little, but now it seemed as if new life was his. Like a bird that wheels and soars and dives as if for lightness of heart, so did Icarus, until each feather of his plumage had a sheen of silver and of gold. Down, down he darted, so near the water that almost the white-tipped waves caught at his wings as he skimmed over them. Then up, up, up he soared, ever higher, higher still, and when he saw the radiant sun god smiling down on him, the warning of Daedalus was forgotten. As he had excelled other lads in foot races, now did Icarus wish to excel the birds themselves. Daedalus he left far behind, and still upwards he mounted. So strong he felt, so fearless was he, that to him it seemed that he could storm Olympus, that he could call to Apollo as he swept past him in his flight, and dare him to race for a wager from the Aegean Sea to where the sun god's horses took their nightly rest by the trackless seas of the unknown west. In terror his father watched him, and as he called to him in a voice of anguished warning that was drowned by the whistling rush of the air currents through the wings of Icarus, and the moist whisper of the clouds as through them he cleft a way for himself, there befell the dreaded thing. It seemed as though the strong wings had begun to lose their power. Like a wounded bird, Icarus fluttered, lunged sideways from the straight, clean line of his flight, recovered himself, and fluttered again. And then, like the bird into whose soft breast the sure hand of a mighty archer has driven an arrow, downwards he fell, turning over and yet turning again, downwards, ever downwards, until he fell with a plunge into the sea that still was radiant in shining emerald and translucent blue. Then did the car of Apollo drive on. His rays had slain one who was too greatly daring, and now they fondled the little white feathers that had fallen from the broken wings and floated on the water like the petals of a torn flower. On the dead, still face of Icarus they shone, and they spangled as if with diamonds, the wet plumage that still widespread bore him up on the waves. Stricken at heart was Dædalus, but there was no time to lament his son's untimely end, for even now the black prowed ships of Minos might be in pursuit. Onward he flew to safety, and in Sicily built a temple to Apollo, and there hung up his wings as a propitiatory offering to the god who had slain his son. And when grey night came down on that part of the sea that bears the name of Icarus to this day, still there floated the body of the boy whose dreams had come true. For only a little while had he known the exquisite realization of dreamed-of potentialities. For only a few hours tasted the sweetness of perfect pleasure, and then, by an over-daring flight, had lost it all forever. The sorrowing Nereids sang a dirge over him as he was swayed gently hither and thither by the tide, and when the silver stars came out from the dark firmament of heaven and were reflected in the blackness of the sea at night, it was as though a velvet pall, silver-decked in his honour, was spread around the slim white body with its outstretched snowy wings. So much had he dared, so little accomplished. Is it not the oft-told tale of those who have followed Icarus? Yet who can say that gallant youth has lived in vain, when, as Icarus did, he has breasted the very skies, has flown with fearless heart and soul to the provinces of the deathless gods, when, even for the space of a few of the heart-beats of time, he has tasted supreme power, the ecstasy of illimitable happiness. End of Icarus. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 23 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 23. Clytie. The sunbeams are basking on the high walls of the old garden, smiling on the fruit that grows red and golden in their warmth. The bees are humming round the bed of purple heliotrope, and drowsily murmuring in the shelter of the soft petals of the blush roses whose sweetness brings back the fragrance of days that are gone. On the old grey sundial the white-winged pigeons sleepily croon as they preen their snowy plumage, and the Madonna lilies hang their heads like a procession of white-robed nuns who dare not look up from telling their beads until the triumphal procession of an all-conquering warrior has gone by. What can they think of that long line of tall yellow flowers by the garden wall, who turn their faces sunwards with an arrogant assurance, and give stare for stare to golden-haired Apollo as he drives his blazing car triumphant through the high heavens? Sunflowers is the name by which we know those flamboyant blossoms, which somehow fail so wholly to suggest the story of Clytie, the nymph whose destruction came from a faithful, unrequited love. She was a water nymph, a timid, gentle being who frequented lonely streams, and bathed where the blue dragonflies dart across the white water lilies in pellucid lakes. In the shade of the tall poplar trees and the silvery willows she took her midday rest, and feared the hours when the flowers drooped their heads and the rippling water lost its coolness before the fierce glare of the sun. But there came a day when into the dark pool by which she sat Apollo the Conqueror looked down and mirrored his face, and never more did she hide from the golden-haired god, who, from the moment when she had seen in the water the picture of his radiant beauty, became the lord and master of her heart and soul. All night she awaited his coming, and the dawn saw her looking eastward for the first golden gleams from the wheels of his chariot. All day she followed him with her longing gaze, nor did she ever cease to feast her eyes upon his beauty until the last reflection of his radiance had faded from the western sky. Such devotion might have touched the heart of the sun god, but he had no wish to own a love for which he had not sought. The nymph's adoration irked him, nor did pity come as love's pale substitute when he marked how, day by day, her face grew whiter and more white, and her lovely form wasted away. For 9 days, without food or drink, she kept her shamed vigil. Only one word of love did she crave. Unexacting in the humility of her devotion, she would gratefully have nourished her hungry heart upon one kindly glance. But Apollo, full of scorn and anger, lashed up his fiery steeds as he each day drove past her, nor deigned for her a glance more gentle than that which he threw on the satyrs as they hid in the dense green foliage of the shadowy woods. Half mocking, Diana said, "In truth, the fair nymph who throws her heart's treasures at the feet of my golden-locked brother that he may trample on them is coming to look like a faded flower." And as she spoke, the hearts of the other immortal dwellers in Olympus were stirred with pity. "A flower she shall be," they said, "and for all time shall she live in life that is renewed each year when the earth stirs with the quickening of spring. The long summer days shall she spend forever in fearless worship of the god of her love." And as they willed, the nymph passed out of her human form and took the form of a flower, and evermore, the emblem of constancy, does she gaze with fearless ardour on the face of her love. The heart that has truly loved never forgets, but as truly loves on to the close. As the sunflower turns on her god when he sets, the same look that she turned when he rose. Some there are who say that not into the bold-faced sunflower did her metamorphosis take place, but into that purple heliotrope that gives an exquisite offering of fragrance to the sun god when his warm rays touch it. And in the old walled garden, while the bees drowsily hum, and the white pigeons croon, and the dashing sunflower gives Apollo gaze for gaze, and the scent of the mignonette mingles with that of clove pinks and blush roses, the fragrance of the heliotrope is, above all, worthy incense to be offered upon his altar by the devout lover of a god. End of Clytie. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 24 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 24. The Cranes of Ibycus. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. Shakespeare. Ibycus, the poet friend of Apollo, was a happy man as he journeyed on foot through the country where the wildflowers grew thick and the trees were laden with blossom towards the city of Corinth. His tuneful voice sang snatches of song of his own making, and ever and again he would try how his words and music sounded on his lyre. He was light of heart, because ever had he thought of good and not evil, and had always sung only of great and noble deeds, and of those things that helped his fellow men. And now he went to Corinth for the great chariot races, and for the great contest of musicians, where every true poet and musician in Greece was sure to be found. It was the time of the return to earth of Adonis and of Proserpine, and as he was reverently about to enter the sacred grove of Poseidon, where the trees grew thick, and saw crowning the height before him the glittering towers of Corinth, he heard overhead the harsh cries of some other returned exiles. Ibycus smiled as he looked up and beheld the great flock of grey birds, with their long legs and strong outstretched wings, come back from their winter sojourn on the golden sands of Egypt, to dance and beck and bow to each other by the marshes of his homeland. "Welcome back, little brothers," he cried. "May you and I both meet with naught but kindness from the people of this land." And when the cranes again harshly cried, as if in answer to his greeting, the poet walked gaily on, further into the shadow of that dark wood out of which he was never to pass as living man. Joyous and fearing no evil, he had been struck and cast to the ground by cruel and murderous hands ere ever he knew that two robbers were hidden in a narrow pass where the brushwood grew thick. With all his strength he fought, but his arms were those of a musician and not of a warrior, and very soon he was overpowered by those who assailed him. He cried in vain to gods and to men for help, and in his final agony he heard once more the harsh voices of the migratory birds and the rush of their speeding wings. From the ground where he bled to death he looked up to them. "Take up my cause, dear cranes," he said, "since no voice but yours answers my cry." And the cranes screamed hoarsely and mournfully as if in farewell, as they flapped their way towards Corinth and left the poet lying dead. When his body was found, robbed and terribly wounded, from all over Greece, where he was known and loved, there uprose a great clamour of lamentation. "Is it thus I find you restored to me?" said he who had expected him in Corinth as his honoured guest. "I, who hoped to place the victor's laurels on your head when you triumphed in the temple of song." And all those whom the loving personality of Ibycus and the charm of his music had made his friends were alert and eager to avenge so foul a murder. But none knew how the wicked deed had come to pass, none save the cranes. Then came the day to which Ibycus had looked forward with such joy, when thousands upon thousands of his countrymen sat in the theatre at Cyprus and watched a play that stirred their hearts within them. The theatre had for roof the blue vault of heaven. The sun served for footlights and for the lights above the heads of those who acted. The three Furies, the Eumenides, with their hard and cruel faces and snaky locks, and with blood dripping from their eyes, were represented by actors so great that the hearts of their beholders trembled within them. In their dread hands lay the punishment of murder, of inhospitality, of ingratitude, and of all the cruellest and basest of crimes. Theirs was the duty of hurrying the doomed spirits entrusted to their merciless care over the Phlegethon, the river of fire that flows round Hades, and through the brazen gates that led to torment, and their robes were robes worn with all the pomp of horror, dyed in gore. Virgil. In solemn cadence, while the thousands of beholders watched and listened enthralled, the Furies walked round the theatre and sang their song of terror. "Woe, woe to him whose hands are soiled with blood! The darkness shall not hide him, nor shall his dread secret lie hidden even in the bowels of the earth. He shall not seek by flight to escape us, for vengeance is ours, and swifter than a hawk that strikes its quarry shall we strike. Unwearying we pursue, nor are our swift feet and our avenging arms made slow by pity. Woe, woe to the shedder of innocent blood, for nor peace nor rest is his until we have hurried his tormented soul down to torture that shall endure everlastingly." As the listeners heard the dirge of doom, there were none who did not think of Ibycus, the gentle-hearted poet, so much beloved and so foully done to death. And in the tensity of the moment, when the voices ceased, a great thrill passed over the multitudes as a voice, shrill with amazed horror, burst from one of the uppermost benches. "See there! See there! Behold, comrade, the cranes of Ibycus!" Every eye looked upwards, and harshly crying, there passed overhead the flock of cranes to whom the poet had entrusted his dying message. Then, like an electric shock, there came to all those who beheld the knowledge that he who had cried aloud was the murderer of Ibycus. "Seize him! Seize him!" cried in unison the voices of thousands. "Seize the man and him to whom he spoke!" Frantically, the trembling wretch tried to deny his words, but it was too late. The roar of the multitudes was as that of an angry sea that hungers for its prey and will not be denied. He who had spoken and him to whom he spoke were seized by a score of eager hands. In white-faced terror, because the Furies had hunted them down, they made confession of their crime and were put to death. And the flock of grey-plumaged, rosy-headed cranes winged their way on to the marshes, there to beck and bow to each other, and to dance in the golden sunset, well content because their message was delivered. And Ibycus, the poet-musician, who had given them welcome, was avenged. End of The Cranes of Ibycus. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 25 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 25. Syrinx. Is it because the wildwood passion still lingers in our hearts, because still in our minds the voice of Syrinx lingers in melancholy music, the music of regret and longing, that for most of us there is so potent a spell in running waters? Fiona Macleod. As the evening shadows lengthen and the night wind softly steals through the trees, touching with restless fingers the still waters of the little lochans that would fain have rest, there can be heard a long, long whisper like a sigh. There is no softer, sadder note to be heard in all Pan's great orchestra, nor can one marvel that it should be so, for the whisper comes from the reeds, who gently sway their heads while the wind passes over them as they grow by lonely lake or river. This is the story of Syrinx, the reed, as Ovid has told it to us. In Arcadia there dwelt a nymph whose name was Syrinx. So fair she was that, for her dear sake, fauns and satyrs forgot to gambol, and sat in the green woods in thoughtful stillness, that they might see her as she passed. But for none of them had Syrinx a word of kindness. She had no wish for love. But as for love, truly I know him not. I have passionately turned my lips therefrom, and from that fate the careless gods allot. Lady Margaret Sackville. To one only of the gods did she give her loyal allegiance. She worshipped Diana, and with her followed the chase. As she lightly sped through the forest, she might have been Diana herself. And there were those who said they would not know nymph from goddess, but that the goddess carried a silver bow, while that of Syrinx was made of horn. Fearless and without a care or sorrow, Syrinx passed her happy days. Not for all the gold of Midas would she have changed places with those lovelorn nymphs who sighed their hearts out for love of a god or of a man. Heart whole, fancy free, gay and happy and lithe and strong as a young boy whose joy it is to run and to excel in the chase, was Syrinx, whose white arms against the greenwood trees dazzled the eyes of the watching fauns when she drew back her bow to speed an arrow at the stag she had hunted since early dawn. Each morning that she awoke was the morning of a day of joy. Each night that she lay down to rest, it was to sleep as a child who smiles in his sleep at the remembrance of a perfect day. But to Syrinx, who knew no fear, fear came at last. She was returning one evening from the shadowy hills, untired by the chase that had lasted for many an hour, when face to face she met with one whom hitherto she had only seen from afar. Of him the other nymphs spoke often. Who was so great as Pan, Pan who ruled the woods? None could stand against Pan. Those who defied him must ever come under his power in the end. He was fear, he was youth, he was joy, he was love, he was beast, he was power, he was man, he was God. He was life itself. So did they talk, and Syrinx listened with a smile. Not Pan himself could bring fear to her. Yet when he met her in the silent loneliness of a great forest, and stood in her path and gazed on her with eyes of joyous amazement that one so fair should be in his kingdom without his having had knowledge of it, Syrinx felt something come to her heart that never before had assailed it. Pan's head was crowned with sharp pine leaves. His face was young and beautiful, and yet older than the mountains and the seas. Sadness and joy were in his eyes at the same time, and at the same moment there looked out from them unutterable tenderness and merciless cruelty. For only a little space of time did he stand and hold her eyes with his own, and then in low caressing voice he spoke, and his words were like the song of a bird to his mate, like the call of the earth to the sun in spring, like the lap of the waves when they tell the rocks of their eternal longing. Of love he spoke, of love that demanded love, and of the nymph's most perfect beauty. Yet as he spoke, the unknown thing came and smote with icy hands the heart of Syrinx. "Ah, I have fear! I have fear!" she cried, and more cruel grew the cruelty in the eyes of Pan. But his words were still the words of passionate tenderness. Like a bird that trembles, helpless before the serpent that would slay it, so did Syrinx the huntress stand, and her face in the shade of the forest was like a white lily in the night. But when the god would have drawn her close to him and kissed her red lips, fear leaped to terror, and terror winged her feet. Never in the chase with Diana had she run as now she ran, but like a rushing storm did Pan pursue her. And when he laughed, she knew that what the nymphs had said was true. He was power, he was fear, he was beast, he was life itself. The darkness of the forest swiftly grew more dark. The climbing trails of ivy and the fragrant creeping plants caught her flying feet and made her stumble. Branches and twigs grew alive and snatched at her and balked her as she passed. Trees blocked her path. All nature had grown cruel, and everywhere there seemed to her to be a murmur of mocking laughter, laughter from the creatures of Pan, echoing the merciless merriment of their lord and master. Nearer he came, ever nearer. Almost she could feel his breath on her neck. But even as he stretched out his arms to seize the nymph, whose breath came with sobs like that of a young doe spent by the chase, they reached the brink of the river Ladon, and to her watery sisters, the nymphs of the river, Syrinx breathed a desperate prayer for pity and for help, then stumbled forward, a quarry run to the death. With an exultant shout, Pan grasped her as she fell, and lo! in his arms he held no exquisite body with fiercely beating heart, but a clump of slender reeds. Baffled, he stood for a little space, and as he stood, the savagery of the beast faded from his eyes that were fathomless as dark mountain tarns where the sun rays seldom come, and there came into them a man's unutterable woe. At the reeds by the river he gazed, and sighed a great sigh, the sigh that comes from the heart of a god who thinks of the pain of the world. Like a gentle zephyr, the sigh breathed through the reeds, and from the reeds there came a sound as of the sobbing sorrow of the world's desire. Then Pan drew his sharp knife, and with it he cut 7 of the reeds that grew by the murmuring river. "Thus shalt thou still be mine, my Syrinx," he said. Deftly he bound them together, cut them into unequal lengths, and fashioned for himself an instrument that to this day is called the syrinx, or Pan's pipes. So did the god make music. And all that night he sat by the swift-flowing river, and the music from his pipe of reeds was so sweet and yet so passing sad that it seemed as though the very heart of the earth itself was telling of its sadness. Thus Syrinx still lives, still dies. A note of music by its own breath slain, blown tenderly from the frail heart of a reed. And as the evening light comes down on silent places, and the trembling shadows fall on the water, we can hear her mournful whisper through the swaying reeds, brown and silvery golden, that grow by lonely lochen and lake and river. End of Syrinx. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 26 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 26. The Death of Adonis. The fairest youth that ever maiden's dream conceived. Lewis Morris. The ideally beautiful woman, a subject throughout the centuries for all the greatest powers of sculptors' and painters' art, is Venus or Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and of love. And he who shares with her an unending supremacy of perfection of form is not one of the gods, her equals, but a mortal lad, who was the son of a king. As Aphrodite sported one day with Eros, the little god of love, by accident she wounded herself with one of his arrows, and straightway there came into her heart a strange longing and an ache such as the mortal victims of the bow of Eros knew well. While still the ache remained, she heard in a forest of cypress the baying of hounds and the shouts of those who urged them on in the chase. For her the chase possessed no charms, and she stood aside while the quarry burst through the branches and thick undergrowth of the wood, and the hounds followed in hot pursuit. But she drew her breath sharply, and her eyes opened wide in amazed gladness when she looked on the perfect beauty of the fleet-footed hunter, who was only a little less swift than the shining spear that sped from his hand with the sureness of a bolt from the hand of Zeus. And she knew that this must be none other than Adonis, son of the king of Paphos, of whose matchless beauty she had heard not only the dwellers on earth, but the Olympians themselves speak in wonder. While gods and men were ready to pay homage to his marvellous loveliness, to Adonis himself it counted for nothing. But in the vigour of his perfect frame he rejoiced, in his fleetness of foot, in the power of that arm that Michelangelo has modelled, in the quickness and sureness of his aim, for the boy was a mighty hunter with a passion for the chase. Aphrodite felt that her heart was no longer her own, and knew that the wound that the arrow of Eros had dealt would never heal until she knew that Adonis loved her. No longer was she to be found by the Cytherean shores, or in those places once held by her most dear, and the other gods smiled when they beheld her vying with Diana in the chase, and following Adonis as he pursued the roe, the wolf, and the wild boar through the dark forest and up the mountain side. The pride of the goddess of love must often have hung its head, for her love was a thing that Adonis could not understand. He held her something better than his dog, a little dearer than his horse, and wondered at her whim to follow his hounds through brake and marsh and lonely forest. His reckless courage was her pride and her torture. Because he was to her so infinitely dear, his path seemed ever bestrewn with dangers. But when she spoke to him with anxious warning and begged him to beware of the fierce beasts that might one day turn on him and bring him death, the boy laughed mockingly and with scorn. There came at last a day when she asked him what he did on the morrow, and Adonis told her with sparkling eyes that had no heed for her beauty that he had word of a wild boar, larger, older, more fierce than any he had ever slain, and which, before the chariot of Diana next passed over the land of Cyprus, would be lying dead with a spear wound through it. With terrible foreboding, Aphrodite tried to dissuade him from his venture. "Oh, be advised! Thou knowest not what it is, with javelin's point a churlish swine to gore. whose tushes never sheathed he whetteth still, like to a mortal butcher bent to kill. Alas, he naught esteems that face of thine, to which love's eyes pay tributary gazes, nor thy soft hands, sweet lips, and crystal eyne, whose full perfection all the world amazes. But having thee at vantage, wondrous dread, would root these beauties as he roots the mead. Shakespeare. To all her warnings Adonis would but give smiles. Ill would it become to him to slink abashed away before the fierceness of an old monster of the woods, and, laughing in the pride of a whole-hearted boy at a woman's idle fears, he sped homewards with his hounds. With the gnawing dread of a mortal woman in her soul, Aphrodite spent the next hours. Early she sought the forest that she might again plead with Adonis, and maybe persuade him, for love of her, to give up the perilous chase, because she loved him so. But even as the rosy gates of the dawn were opening, Adonis had begun his hunt, and from afar off the goddess could hear the baying of his hounds. Yet surely their clamour was not that of hounds in full cry, nor was it the triumphant noise that they so fiercely make as they pull down their vanquished quarry, but rather was it baying, mournful as that of the hounds of Hecate. Swift as a great bird, Aphrodite reached the spot from whence came the sound that made her tremble. Amidst the trampled brake, where many a hound lay stiff and dead, while others, disembowelled by the tusks of the boar, howled aloud in mortal agony, lay Adonis. As he lay, he knew the strange, slow chill which, stealing, tells the young that it is death. And as, in extremis, he thought of past things, manhood came to Adonis, and he knew something of the meaning of the love of Aphrodite, a love stronger than life, than time, than death itself. His hounds and his spear seemed but playthings now. Only the eternities remained, bright life and black-robed death. Very still he lay, as though he slept, marble white and beautiful as a statue wrought by the hand of a god. But from the cruel wound in the white thigh, ripped open by the boar's profaning tusk, the red blood dripped in rhythmic flow, crimsoning the green moss under him. With a moan of unutterable anguish, Aphrodite threw herself beside him and pillowed his dear head in her tender arms. Then, for a little while, life's embers flickered up. His cold lips tried to form themselves into a smile of understanding and held themselves up to hers. And while they kissed, the soul of Adonis passed away. A cruel, cruel wound on his thigh hath Adonis, but a deeper wound in her heart doth Cytherea bear. About him his dear hounds are loudly baying, and the nymphs of the wild woods wail him. But Aphrodite, with unbound locks, through the glades goes wandering, wretched, with hair unbraided, with feet unsandaled, and the thorns as she passes wound her and pluck the blossom of her sacred blood. Shrill she wails as down the woodland she is borne, and the rivers bewail the sorrows of Aphrodite, and the wells are weeping Adonis on the mountains. The flowers flush red for anguish, and Cytherea, through all the mountain knees, through every dell, doth utter piteous dirge. Woe, woe for Cytherea! He hath perished, the lovely Adonis. Bion. Passionately the god besought Zeus to give her back her lost love, and when there was no answer to her prayers, she cried in bitterness, "Yet shall I keep a memorial of Adonis that shall be to all everlasting." And as she spoke, her tears and his blood, mingled together, were turned into flowers. A tear the Paphian sheds for each blood drop of Adonis, and tears and blood on the earth are turned to flowers. The blood brings forth the roses, the tears, the windflower. Yet even then the grief of Aphrodite knew no abatement, and when Zeus, wearied with her crying, heard her, to his amazement, begged to be allowed to go down to the shades that she might there endure eternal twilight with the one of her heart, his soul was softened. Never can it be that the Queen of Love and of Beauty leaves Olympus and the pleasant earth to tread for evermore the dark Cocytus valley, he said. Nay, rather shall I permit the beauteous youth of thy love to return for half of each year from the underworld, that thou and he may together know the joy of a love that hath reached fruition. Thus did it come to pass that when dark winter's gloom was past, Adonis returned to the earth and to the arms of her who loved him. But even in death so strong is love, I could not wholly die. And year by year, when the bright springtime comes and the earth lives, love opens these dread gates and calls me forth across the gulf. Not here, indeed, she comes, being a goddess and in heaven, but smooths my path to the old earth, where still I know once more the sweet lost days, and once again blossom on that soft breast, and am again a youth and wrapped in love. And yet not all as careless as of yore, but seem to know the early spring of passion, tamed by time and suffering to a calmer, fuller flow, less fitful, but more strong. Lewis Morris. And when the time of the singing of birds has come, and the flowers have thrown off their white snow pall, and the brown earth grows radiant in its adornments of green blade and of fragrant blossom, we know that Adonis has returned from his exile, and trace his footprints by the fragile flower that is his very own, the white flower with the golden heart, that trembles in the wind as once the white hands of a grief-stricken goddess shook for sorrow. The flower of death is the name that the Chinese give to the windflower, the wood anemone. Yet surely the flower that was born of tears and of blood tells us of a life that is beyond the grave, of a love which is unending. The cruel tusk of a rough, remorseless winter still yearly slays the lovely Adonis and drives him down to the shades. Yet we know that spring, with its sursum corda, will return as long as the earth shall endure, even as the sun must rise each day so long as time shall last, to make "le ciel tout en fleur semble une immense rose, qu'un Adonis céleste attient de son sang." De Heredia. End of The Death of Adonis. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 27 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 27. Pan. What was he doing, the great god Pan, down in the reeds by the river? Spreading ruin and scattering ban, splashing and paddling with hoofs of a goat, and breaking the golden lilies afloat with the dragonfly on the river. He tore out a reed, the great god Pan, from the deep cool bed of the river. The limpid water turbidly ran, and the broken lilies a-dying lay, and the dragonfly had fled away, ere he brought it out of the river. "This is the way," laughed the great god Pan, laughed while he sat by the river, "the only way, since gods began to make sweet music, they could succeed." Then, dropping his mouth to a hole in the reed, he blew in power by the river. Sweet, 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 O Pan, piercing sweet by the river. Blinding sweet, O great god Pan. The sun on the hill forgot to die, and the lilies revived, and the dragonfly came back to dream on the river. Yet half a beast is the great god Pan, to laugh as he sits by the river, making a poet out of a man. The true gods sigh for the cost and pain, for the reed which grows never more again, as a reed with the reeds in the river. E. B. Browning. Were we to take the whole of that immense construction of fable that was once the religion of Greece, and treat it as a vast play in which there were many thousands of actors, we should find that one of these actors appeared again and again. In one scene, then in another, in connection with one character, then with another, unexpectedly slipping out from the shadows of the trees from the first act even to the last, we should see Pan, so young and yet so old, so heedlessly gay, yet so infinitely sad. If, rather, we were to regard the mythology of Greece as a colossal and wonderful piece of music, where the thunders of Jupiter and the harsh hoof-beats of the fierce black steeds of Pluto, the king whose coming none can stay, made way for the limpid melodies of Orpheus and the rustling whisper of the footfall of nymphs and of fauns on the leaves, through it all we should have an ever-recurring motif, the clear, magical fluting of the pipes of Pan. We have the stories of Pan and of Echo, of Pan and of Midas, of Pan and Syrinx, of Pan and Selene, of Pan and Pitys, of Pan and Pomona. Pan it was who taught Apollo how to make music. It was Pan who spoke what he deemed to be comfort to the distraught Psyche, Pan who gave Diana her hounds. The other gods had their own special parts in the great play that at one time would have Olympus for stage, at another the earth. Pan was nature incarnate. He was the earth itself. Many are the stories of his genealogy, but the one that is given in one of the Homeric hymns is that Hermes, the swift-footed young god, wedded Dryope, the beautiful daughter of a shepherd in Arcadia, and to them was born, under the greenwood tree, the infant Pan. When Dryope first looked on her child, she was smitten with horror and fled away from him. The deserted baby roared lustily, and when his father, Hermes, examined him, he found a rosy-cheeked thing with pricked ears and tiny horns that grew amongst his thick curls, and with the dappled furry chest of a fawn, while instead of dimpled baby legs he had the strong, hairy hind legs of a goat. He was a fearless creature, and merry withal, and when Hermes had wrapped him up in a hare-skin, he sped to Olympus and showed his fellow gods the son that had been born to him and the beautiful nymph of the forest. Baby though he was, Pan made the Olympians laugh. He had only made a woman, his own mother, cry. All others rejoiced at the new creature that had come to increase their merriment. And Bacchus, who loved him most of all, and felt that here was a babe after his own heart, bestowed on him the name by which he was forever known, Pan, meaning all. Thus Pan grew up, the earthly equal of the Olympians. And as he grew, he took to himself the lordship of woods and of solitary places. He was king of huntsmen and of fishermen, lord of flocks and herds, and of all the wild creatures of the forest. All living, soulless things owned him their master. Even the wild bees claimed him as their overlord. He was ever merry, and when a riot of music and of laughter slew the stillness of the shadowy woods, it was Pan who led the dancing throng of white-limbed nymphs and gambling satyrs, for whom he made melody from the pipes for whose creation a maid had perished. Round his horns and thick curls he presently came to wear a crown of sharp pine leaves, remembrance of another fair nymph whose destruction he had brought about. Pitys listened to the music of Pan, and followed him even as the children followed the Pied Piper of later story. And ever his playing lured her further on, and into more dangerous and desolate places, until at length she stood on the edge of a high cliff, whose pitiless front rushed sheer down to cruel rocks far below. There Pan's music ceased, and Pitys knew all the joy and the sorrow of the world as the god held out his arms to embrace her. But neither Pan nor Pitys had remembrance of Boreas, the merciless north wind, whose love the nymph had flouted. Ere Pan could touch her, a blast, fierce and strong as death, had seized the nymph's fragile body, and as a wind of March tears from the tree the first white blossom that has dared to brave the ruthless gales, and casts it, torn and dying, to the earth, so did Boreas grip the slender Pitys and dash her life out on the rocks far down below. From her body sprang the pine tree, slender, erect, clinging for dear life to the sides of precipices, and by the prickly wreath he always wore, Pan showed that he held her in fond remembrance. Joy and youth and force and spring was Pan to all the creatures whose overlord he was. Pan meant the richness of the sap in the trees, the lushness of grass, and of the green stems of the blue hyacinths and the golden daffodils, the throbbing of growth in the woodland and in the meadows, the trilling of birds that seek for their mates and find them, the coo of the doves on their nests of young, the arrogant virility of bulls and of stags, whose lowing and belling wake the silence of the hills, the lightness of heart that made the nymphs dance and sing, the fauns leap high and shout aloud for very joy of living. All of these things was Pan to those of his own kingdom. Yet to the human men and women who had also listened to his playing, Pan did not mean only joyousness. He was to them a force that many times became a terror because of its sheer irresistibleness. While the sun shone and the herdsmen could see the nodding white cotton grass, the asphodel, and the golden kingcups that hid the black death traps of the pitiless marshes, they had no fear of Pan. Nor in the daytime, when in the woods the sunbeams played amongst the trees, and the birds sang of spring and of love, and the syrinx sent an echo from far away that made the little silver birches give a whispering laugh of gladness, and the pines cease to sigh, did man or maid have any fear. Yet when darkness fell on the land, terror would come with it, and deep in their hearts they would know that the terror was Pan. Blindly, madly, they would flee from something that they could not see, something they could barely hear, and many times rush to their own destruction. And there would be no sweet sound of music then, only mocking laughter. Panic was the name given to this fear, the name by which it is still known. And to this day panic yet comes, and not only by night, but only in very lonely places. There are those who have known it, and for shame have scarce dared to own it. In highland glens, in the loneliness of an island in the western sea, in a green valley amongst the solemn, kindly, round-backed hills of the Scottish border, in the remoteness of the Australian bush. They have no reasons to give, or their reasons are far-fetched. Only to them, as to Mowgli, fear came, and the fear seemed to them to come from a malignant something from which they must make all haste to flee did they value safety of mind and of body. Was it for this reason that the Roman legionaries on the great wall so often reared altars in that lonely land of moor and mountain, where so many of them fought and died? To Pan and to the sylvan deities? For surely Pan was there, where the curlew cried and the pewit mourned, and sometimes the waiting soldiers must almost have imagined his mocking laughter borne in the winds that swept across the bleak hills of their exiled solitude. He who was surely one of the bravest of mankind, one who always, in his own words, clung to his paddle, writes of such a fear when he escaped death by drowning from the Wise in flood. The devouring element in the universe had leaped out against me in this green valley quickened by a running stream. The bells were all very pretty in their way, but I had heard some of the hollow notes of Pan's music. Would the wicked river drag me down by the heels? Indeed, and look so beautiful all the time? Nature's good humour was only skin deep after all. And of the reeds he writes, Pan once played upon their forefathers, and so, by the hands of his river, he still plays upon these later generations, down all the valley of the Wise, and plays the same air, both sweet and shrill, to tell us of the beauty and the terror of the world. The beauty and the terror of the world. Was not this what Pan stood for to the Greeks of long ago? The gladness of living, the terror of living, the exquisite joy and the infinite pain, that has been the possession of Pan, for we have not yet found a more fitting title since ever time began. And because Pan is as he is, from him has evolved a higher pantheism. We have done away with his goat's feet and his horns, although these were handed on from him to Satan when Christianity broke down the altars of paganism. Nature, which is the time vesture of God and reveals him to the wise, hides him from the foolish, writes Carlyle. Pan is nature, and nature is not the ugly thing that the Calvinists would once have had us believe it to be. Nature is capable of being made the garment of God. In beings, floods; in actions, storm. I walk and work, above, beneath, work and weave in endless motion, birth and death and infinite ocean, a seizing and giving the fire of living. 'Tis thus at the roaring loom of time I ply, and weave for God the garment thou seest him by. So speaks the Erdgeist in Goethe's Faust, and yet another of the greatest poets writes: "The sun, the moon, the stars, the seas, the hills and the plains, are not these, O soul, the vision of him who reigns? And the ear of man cannot hear, and the eye of man cannot see. But if we could see and hear this vision, were it not he?" Tennyson. Carlyle says that the whole universe is the garment of God, and he who lives very close to nature must, at least once in a lifetime, come in the solitude of the lonely mountain tops upon that bush that burns and is not yet consumed, and out of the midst of which speaks the voice of the Eternal. The immortal soul, the human body, united yet ever in conflict, that is Pan. The sighing and longing for things that must endure everlastingly, the riotous enjoyment of the beauty of life, the perfect appreciation of the things that are. Life is so real, so strong, so full of joyousness and of beauty. And on the other side of a dark stream, cold, menacing, cruel, stands death. Yet life and death make up the sum of existence. And until we, who live our paltry little lives here on earth in the hope of a beyond, can realize what is the true air that is played on those pipes of Pan, there is no hope for us of even a vague comprehension of the illimitable immortality. It is a very old tale that tells us of the passing of Pan. In the reign of Tiberius, on that day when, on the hill of Calvary at Jerusalem in Syria, Jesus Christ died as a malefactor on the cross. And it was about the 6th hour, and there was a darkness all over the earth. Thamus, an Egyptian pilot, was guiding a ship near the islands of Paxae in the Ionian Sea. And to him came a great voice, saying, "Go, make everywhere the proclamation, 'Great Pan is dead.'" And from the poop of his ship, when in great heaviness of heart, because for him the joy of the world seemed to have passed away, Thamus had reached Pallades, he shouted aloud the words that he had been told. Then from all the earth there arose a sound of great lamentation, and the sea and the trees, the hills and all the creatures of Pan sighed in sobbing unison an echo of the pilot's words, "Pan is dead, Pan is dead." The lonely mountains o'er, and the resounding shore, a voice of weeping heard, and loud lament. From haunted spring and dale, edged with poplar pale, the parting genius is with sighing sent. With flower and woven tresses torn, the nymphs in twilight shade of tangled thickets mourn. Milton. Pan was dead, and the gods died with him. Gods of Hellas! Gods of Hellas, can ye listen in your silence? Can your mystic voices tell us where ye hide? In floating islands, with a wind that evermore keeps you out of sight of shore? Pan, Pan is dead. Gods, we vainly do adjure you. Ye return nor voice nor sign. Not a votary could secure you even a grave for your divine. Not a grave to show thereby, here these grey old gods do lie. Pan, Pan is dead. E.B. Browning. Pan is dead. In the old Hellenistic sense, Pan is gone forever. Yet until nature has ceased to be, the thing we call Pan must remain a living entity. Some there be who call his music, when he makes all humanity dance to his piping, joie de vie, and de Musset speaks of le vin de la jeunesse, which ferments dans le vin de Dieu. It is Pan who inspires Seamus, the old islander, of whom Fiona Macleod writes, and who, looking towards the sea at sunrise, says, "Every morning like this, I take my hat off to the beauty of the world." Half of the flesh and half of the spirit is Pan. There are some who have never come into contact with him, who know him only as the emblem of paganism, a cruel thing, more beast than man, trampling with goat's feet on the gentlest flowers of spring. They know not the meaning of the green fire of life, nor have they ever known Pan's moods of tender sadness. Never to them has come in the forest, where the great grey trunks of the beeches rise from a carpet of primroses and blue hyacinths, and the slender silver beeches are the guardian angels of the starry wood anemones, and the sunbeams slant through the oak and beech leaves of tender green and play on the dead amber leaves of a year that is gone, the whisper of little feet that cannot be seen, the piercing sweet music from very far away that fills the heart with gladness and yet with a strange pain, the ache of the Weltschmerz, the echo of the pipes of Pan. Oftenest in the dark woods I hear him sing dim, half-remembered things, where the old mosses cling to the old trees, and the faint wandering eddies bring the phantom echoes of a phantom spring. Fiona Macleod. End of Pan. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 28 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 28. Lorelei. Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin. Ein Märchen aus alten Zeiten, das kommt mir nicht aus dem Sinn. Die schönste Jungfrau sitzet dort oben wunderbar. Ihr goldnes Geschmeide blitzet, sie kämmt ihr goldnes Haar. Sie kämmt es mit goldnem Kamme und singt ein Lied dabei. Das hat eine wundersame, gewaltige Melodie. Heine. In every land, north and south, east and west, from sea to sea, myth and legend hand down to us, as cruel and malignant creatures who ceaselessly seek to slay man's body and to destroy his soul, the half-human children of the restless sea and of the fiercely running streams. In Scotland and in Australia, in every part of Europe, we have tales of horrible formless things which frequent lonely rivers and lochs and marshes, and to meet which must mean death. And equal in malignity with them, and infinitely more dangerous, are the beautiful beings who would seem to claim descent from Lilith, the soulless wife of Adam. Such were the sirens who would have compassed the destruction of Odysseus. Such are the mermaids. To wed with one of whom must bring unutterable woe upon any of the sons of men. In lonely, far-off places by the sea there still are tales of exquisite melodies heard in the gloaming, or at night when the moon makes a silver pathway across the water. Still are there stories of women whose home is in the depths of the ocean, and who come to charm away men's souls by their beauty and by their pitiful longing for human love. Those who have looked on the yellow-green waters of the Seine, or who have seen the more turbid, more powerful Thames sweeping her serious, majestic way down towards the open ocean at Westminster or at London Bridge, can perhaps realise something of that inwardness of things that made the people of the past, and that makes the mentally uncontrolled people of the present feel a fateful power calling upon them to listen to the insistence of the exacting waters, and to surrender their lives and their souls forever to a thing that called and which would brook no denial. In the morgue, or in a mortuary by the riverside, their poor bodies have lain when the rivers have worked their will with them, and suicide, death by drowning, or by misadventure, have been the verdicts given. We live in a too practical, too utterly commonsensical age to conceive a poor woman with nothing on earth left to live for, being lured down to the shades by a creature of the water, or a man who longs for death seeing a beautiful daughter of a river god beckoning to him to come where he will find peace everlasting. Yet ever we war with the sea. All of us know her seductive charm, but all of us fear her. The boundary line between our fear of the fierce, remorseless, ever-seeking, cruel waves that lap up life swiftly as a thirsty beast laps water, and the old belief in cruel sea creatures that sought constantly for the human things that were to be their prey, is a very narrow one. And once we have seen the sea in a rage, flinging herself in terrible anger against the poor, frail toy that the hands of men have made, and that was intended to rule and to resist her, foaming and frothing over the decks of the thing that carries human lives, we can understand much of the old pagan belief. If one has watched a river in spate, red as with blood, rushing triumphantly over all resistance, smashing down the trees that balk it, sweeping away each poor, helpless thing, brute or human, that it encounters, dealing out ruin and death and proceeding superbly on to carry its trophies of disaster to the bosom of the Ocean Mother, very easy is it to see from whence came those old tales of cruelty, of irresistible strength, of desire. Many are the tales of sea maidens who have stolen men's lives from them and sent their bodies to move up and down amidst the wrack, like broken toys with which a child has grown tired of playing and cast away in weariness. In an 8th century chronicle concerning St. Fechin, we read of evil powers whose rage is seen in that watery fury and their hellish hate and turbulence in the beating of the sea against the rocks. The bitter gifts of our Lord Poseidon is the name given to them by one of the earliest poets of Greece and a poet of our own time, poet of the sea, of running water, and of lonely places, quotes from the saying of a fisherman of the Isle of Ulva words that show why simple minds have so many times materialized the restless, devouring element into the form of a woman who is very beautiful, but whose tender mercies are very cruel. "She is like a woman of the old tales whose beauty is dreadful," said Seamus the Islander, "and who breaks your heart at last, whether she smiles or frowns. But she doesn't care about that, or whether you are hurt or not. It's because she has no heart, being all a wild water." Treacherous, beautiful, remorseless. That is how men regard the sea and the rushing rivers of whom the sirens and mermaids of old tradition have come to stand as symbols. Treacherous and pitiless, yet with a fascination that can draw even the moon and the stars to her breast. "Once I sat upon a promontory, and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music. Shakespeare. Very many are the stories of the women of the sea and of the rivers, but that one, who must forever hold her own because Heine has immortalized her in song, is the river maiden of the Rhine, the Lorelei. Near St. Goar there rises out of the waters of the Rhine a perpendicular rock, some 400 feet high. Many a boatman in bygone days there met his death, and the echo which it possesses is still a mournful one. Those who know the great river, under which lies hid the treasure of the Nibelungs, with its gleaming towns by the riverside and the green vineyards combed along the hills, and who have felt the romance of the rugged crags crowned by ruined castles that stand like fantastic and very ancient sentries to guard its channel, can well understand how easy of belief was the legend of the Lorelei. Down the green waters came the boatman's frail craft, ever drawing nearer to the perilous rock. All his care and all his skill were required to avert a very visible danger. But high above him, from the rock round which the swirling eddies splashed and foamed, there came a voice. Her voice was like the voice the stars had when they sang together. And when the boatman looked up at the sound of such sweet music, he beheld a maiden more fair than any he had ever dreamed of. On the rock she sat, combing her long golden hair with a comb of red gold. Her limbs were white as foam, and her eyes green like the emerald green of the rushing river. And her red lips smiled on him, and her arms were held out to him in welcome, and the sound of her song thrilled through the heart of him who listened, and her eyes drew his soul to her arms. Forgotten was all peril. The rushing stream seized the little boat and did with it as it willed. And while the boatman still gazed upwards, intoxicated by her matchless beauty and the magic of her voice, his boat was swept against the rock, and with the jar and crash, knowledge came back to him, and he heard, with broken heart, the mocking laughter of the Lorelei, as he was dragged down as if by 1,000 icy hands, and with a choking sigh surrendered his life to the pitiless river. To one man only was it granted to see the siren so near that he could hold her little cold white hands and feel the wondrous golden hair sweep across his eyes. This was a young fisherman who met her by the river and listened to the entrancing songs that she sang for him alone. Each evening she would tell him where to cast his nets on the morrow, and he prospered greatly and was a marvel to all others who fished in the waters of the Rhine. But there came an evening when he was seen joyously hastening down the river bank in response to the voice of the Lorelei that surely never had sounded so honey-sweet before, and he came back nevermore. They said that the Lorelei had dragged him down to her coral caves that he might live with her there forever, and if it were not so, the rushing water could never whisper her secret and theirs of a lifeless plaything that they swept seawards, and that wore a look of horror and of great wonder in its dead, wide-open eyes. It is ein Märchen aus alten Zeiten, a legend of long ago. But it is a very much older Märchen that tells us of the warning of Circe to Odysseus. To the sirens first shalt thou come, who bewitch all men whosoever shall come to them. Whoso draws nigh them unwittingly and hears the sound of the siren's voice, never doth he see wife or babes stand by him on his return, nor have they joy at his coming, but the sirens enchant him with their clear song. And until there shall be no more sea and the rivers have ceased to run, the enchantment that comes from the call of the water to the hearts of men must go on. Day by day the toll of lives is paid, and still the cruel daughters of the deep remain unsatisfied. We can hear their hungry whimper from the rushing river through the night, and the waves of the sea that thunders along the coast would seem to voice the insistence of their desire. And we who listen to their ceaseless, restless moan can say with Heine, "Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin." For the sadness of heart, the melancholy that their music brings us, is a mystery which none on this earth may ever unravel. End of Lorelei. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 29 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jane Lang. Section 29. Freya, Queen of the Northern Gods. Friday's bairn is loving and giving, says the old rhyme that sets forth the special qualities of the children born on each day of the week. And to the superstitious who regard Friday as a day of evil omen, it seems strange that Friday's bairn should be so blessed. But they forget that before Christianity swept paganism before it, and taught those who worshipped the northern gods the story of that first black Good Friday, the tragedy in which all humanity was involved, Friday was the day of Freya, the beloved, gentle protectress and most generous giver of all joys, delights, and pleasures. From her, in medieval times, the high-born women who acted as dispensers to their lords first took the title Fraua, Frau. And when, in its transition stage, the old heathenism had evolved into a religion of strong nature worship, overshadowed by fatalism, only thinly veneered by Christianity, the minds of the Christian converts of Scandinavia, like those of puzzled children, transferred to the Virgin Mary the attributes that had formerly been those of their lady, Freya, the goddess of love. Long before the Madonna was worshipped, Freya gave her name to plants, to flowers, and even to insects. And the child who says to the beautiful little insect that he finds on a leaf, "Ladybird, ladybird, fly away home," is commemorating the name of the lady Freya, to whom his ancestors offered their prayers. In her home in the Hall of Mists, Freya, or Frigga, wife of Odin the All-Father, sat with her golden distaff spinning the clouds. Orion's belt was known as Frigga's spindle by the Norsemen and the men on the earth, as they watched the great cumulus masses of snowy white, golden or silver-edged, the fleecy cloudlets of grey, soft as the feathers on the breast of a dove, or the angry banks of black and purple, portending a storm, had constant proof of the diligence of their goddess. She was the protectress of those who sailed the seas, and the care of children as they came into the world was also hers. Hers, too, was the happy task of bringing together after death lovers whom death had parted, and to her belonged the glorious task of going down to the fields of battle, where the slain lay strewn like leaves in autumn, and leading to Valhalla the half of the warriors who, as heroes, had died. Her vision enabled her to look over all the earth, and she could see into the future, but she held her knowledge as a profound secret that none could prevail upon her to betray. "Of me the gods are sprung, and all that is to come I know, but lock in my own breast and have to none revealed." Matthew Arnold. Thus she came to be pictured crowned with heron plumes, the symbol of silence, the silence of the lonely marshes where the heron stands in mutest contemplation, a tall, very stately, very queenly, wholly beautiful woman, with a bunch of keys at her girdle, symbol of her protection of the northern housewife, sometimes clad in snow-white robes, sometimes in robes of sombre black. And because her care was for the anxious, weary housewife, for the mother and her newborn babe, for the storm-tossed mariner fighting the billows of a hungry sea, for those whose true and pure love had suffered the crucifixion of death, and for the glorious dead on the field of battle, it is very easy to see Freya as her worshippers saw her, an ideal of perfect womanhood. But the gods of the Norsemen were never wholly gods. Always they, like the gods of Greece, endeared themselves to humanity by possessing some little or big human weakness. And Freya is none the less lovable to the descendants of her worshippers because she possessed the so-called feminine weakness of love of dress. Jewels, too, she loved, and knowing the wondrous skill of the dwarfs in fashioning exquisite ornaments, she broke off a piece of gold from the statue of Odin, her husband, and gave it to them to make into a necklace, the marvellous jewelled necklace Brisingamen, that in time to come was possessed by Beowulf. It was so exquisite a thing that it made her beauty twice more perfect, and Odin loved her doubly much because of it. But when he discovered that his statue had been tampered with, his wrath was very great, and furiously he summoned the dwarfs, they who dealt always with fine metal, and demanded of them which of them had done him this grievous wrong. But the dwarfs loved Freya, and from them he got no answer. Then he placed the statue above the temple gate, and laboured with guile to devise runes that might give it the power of speech, so that it might shout aloud the name of the impious robber as the robber went by. Freya, no longer an omnipotent goddess, but a frightened wife, trembled before his wrath, and begged the dwarfs to help her. And when one of them, the most hideous of all, promised that he would prevent the statue from speaking if Freya would but deign to smile upon him, the queen of the gods, who had no dread of ugly things, and whose heart was full of love and of pity, smiled her gentle smile on the piteous little creature who had never known looks of anything but horror and disgust from any of the deathless gods. It was for him a wondrous moment, and the payment was worth death itself. That night a deep sleep fell on the guards of Odin's statue, and while they slept, the statue was pulled down from its pedestal and smashed into pieces. The dwarf had fulfilled his part of the bargain. When Odin next morning discovered the sacrilege, great was his anger, and when no inquiry could find for him the criminal, he quitted Asgard in furious wrath. For 7 months he stayed away, and in that time the ice giants invaded his realm, and all the land was covered with a pall of snow, viciously pinched by black frosts, chilled by clinging, deadening, impenetrable mists. But at the end of 7 dreary months Odin returned, and with him came the blessings of light and of sunshine, and the ice giants in terror fled away. Well was it for woman or for warrior to gain the favour of Freya the beloved, who knew how to rule even Odin, the All-Father himself. The Winilers, who were warring with the Vandals, once sought her aid and gained her promise of help. From Hlidskjalf, the mighty watchtower, highest point in Asgard, from whence Odin and his queen could look down and behold what was happening all the world over, amongst gods and men, dwarfs, elves and giants, and all creatures of their kingdom, Freya watched the Vandals and the Winilers making ready for the battle which was to decide forever which people should rule the other. Night was descending, but in the evening light the two gods beheld the glitter of spears, the gleam of brass helmets and of swords, and heard from afar the hoarse shouts of the warriors as they made ready for the great fight on the morrow. Knowing well that her lord favoured the Vandals, Freya asked him to tell her which army was to gain the victory. "The army upon which my eyes shall first rest when I awake at the dawning," said Odin, full well knowing that his couch was so placed that he could not fail to see the Vandals when he woke. Well pleased with his own astuteness, he then retired to rest, and soon sleep lay heavy on his eyelids. But while he slept, Freya gently moved the couch upon which he lay, so that he must open his eyes not on the army who had won his favour, but on the army that owned hers. To the Winilers she gave command to dress up their women as men, and let them meet the gaze of Odin in the dawning, in full battle array. "Take thou thy womenfolk, maidens and wives. Over your ankles lace on the white war hose. Over your bosoms link up the hard mail nets. Over your lips plait long tresses with cunning. So war beasts full-bearded King Odin shall deem you, when off the grey sea beach at sunrise ye greet him." Charles Kingsley. When the sun sent its first pale green light next morning over grey sky and sea, Odin awoke and gazed from his watch-tower at the army on the beach. And, with great amazement, "What long beards are those?" he cried. "They are Winilers," said Freya in joyous triumph, "but you have given them a new name. Now must you also give them a gift. Let it be the victory, I pray you, dear lord of mine." And Odin, seeing himself outwitted and knowing that honour bade him follow the northern custom and give the people he had named a gift, bestowed on the Longbeards and their men the victory that Freya craved. Nor was the gift of Odin one for that day alone, for to him the Langobarden attributed the many victories that led them at last to find a home in the sunny land of Italy, where beautiful Lombardy still commemorates by its name the stratagem of Freya the Queen. With the coming of Christianity, Freya the Beloved was cast out along with all the other old forgotten gods. The people who had loved and worshipped her were taught that she was an evil thing, and that to worship her was sin. Thus she was banished to the lonely peaks of the mountains of Norway and of Sweden, and to the Brocken in Germany, no longer a goddess to be loved, but transformed into a malignant power, full of horror and of wickedness. On Walpurgis night she led the witches' revels on the Brocken, and the cats who were said to draw her car while still she was regarded as a beneficent protectress of the weak and needy, ceased to be the gentle creatures of Freya the Good, and came under the ban of religion as the satanic companions of witches by habit and repute. One gentle thing only was her memory allowed to keep. When, not as an omnipotent goddess, but as a heartbroken mother, she wept the death of her dearly loved son Baldur the Beautiful, the tears that she shed were turned, as they fell, into pure gold that is found in the beds of lonely mountain streams. And we who claim descent from the peoples who worshipped her, Saxon and Norman and Dane are we, can surely cleanse her memory from all the ugly impurities of superstition, and remember only the pure gold of the fact that our warrior ancestors did not only pray to a fierce and mighty god of battles, but to a woman who was loving and giving, the little child's deification of the mother whom it loves and who holds it very dear. End of Freya, Queen of the Northern Gods. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.